This is Theology Bits, a ministry of Central Lutheran Church, Eugene, Oregon. I'm Pastor Ben. This video is the second in our series, Open Commensality in the Gospel of Luke, or Jesus eating with other people in the Gospel of Luke. The last video was, why was this such a big deal? This video will be looking at who is it Jesus actually eats with. Well, there's three main groups, and then there's some exceptions. There are tax collectors, sinners, and then there are disciples. So three different groups Jesus regularly eats with. There are 2 times that Jesus eats with Pharisees in the Gospel of Luke. But for the most part, it's these 3 groups. Now, I think we have generally misunderstood the significance of what's going on in this context. Last video talked about eating together was worshiping together, and why all the fuss about it. And we kind of covered that. This video, I want to see why was it so specific about these 3 groups, and of course these 2 are the ones that get most of the play. So first of all, we need to understand this a little better. So tax collectors, talones in Greek. We need to gather what is the rap that these figures have gotten, because I think they've gotten, I wouldn't say a bad rap, I think they've gotten the wrong rap. That is to say, to understand this, we need to understand Roman tax system. Now, it's a little bit debated because it was at this time that this was starting to get changed. So we're not 100% sure exactly what was happening in Roman Palestine, but the big picture seems to be the case. Whereas the Romans themselves would actually sell the tax collection to a contractor for an area. And that contractor would purchase I'm going to collect all the taxes from this region, and then I will send the portion that goes to Rome, and then the fees that are for me, the contractor. There seems to have been maybe one figure in the New Testament who fits this description, Zacchaeus, seems to be one of this, as the chief tax collector or toll collector, however you translate that. So maybe Zacchaeus is one of these, we're not sure. But this would have been at the aristocratic status. Who could buy all the taxes for one region? And in some case, they would actually sell it. We have a few evidences they sold it as a flat rate. The person just paid off the Senate, and then they could go collect this taxes for whatever they actually got, often quite lucratively for this very important person. The real people that most people would have expected, though, are not these chief tax collectors, but regular tax collectors, or for some, that's why they like to call them toll collectors, who were just regular people who were doing this job. And the reason they call it tolls, maybe rather than tax, is Americans especially, but I think it's true for Europeans as well, but I don't know as much about that. Think of taxes primarily, I think, income tax, property tax, meaning if you have some assets, you are then taxed based on those assets. And we have big debates in our country about what that tax rate should be, but it does seem to be more or less based upon assets. Here, and sometimes we have sales tax, similar. If you can afford to buy these things, you can afford to pay something. So it depends where you live. Here, though, they didn't do that. People were taxed rather than assets. So tolls might be a better thing. We tend to think of tolls as like on a turnpike, which of course was the original turnpike. You turned the thing after you paid your toll. But they had tolls in any number of things. A person was there, and so the person was taxed. Well, you can imagine people didn't really like this very much because you were taxing some people with no assets in addition to those with assets. And then, but who were these people? Well, there's no evidence at all from the New Testament. There's Levi is supposedly one of these people. Matthew, Levi, another name for him, is one of these people. It doesn't tell us a lot about him other than he is able to leave his job and follow Jesus. And I say that because there is some sense where there might have even been a mix of free people and enslaved people who both filled this role. Now, there's been, for a long time, this idea of these people were especially corrupt. That is, they were supposed to charge so much, they charged more. Well, that might not be the case. Because that was in fact how they were paid, was that you were supposed to, on commission, take a little bit more. And yes, there were probably some abusing that, but we don't actually have a lot of evidence for it, mostly because we don't have a lot of evidence for these people. But what we do have is these were Roman taxes. So rather than them being castigated for being corrupt, they would be castigated for being a collaborator. You are someone who is in cahoots with the Roman Empire, these external authorities who are taxing us and providing us nothing in return, and all they do is take our freedom, take our money. And that sense was very much the case. And frankly, it was also true. Rome provided very little, and Rome, all they cared about was keeping the taxes flowing and that there would be no revolt. And so you were, if you were a tax collector, a Roman collaborator, but clearly a local person. And that was also true of the Roman Empire. They didn't want to send in their own officials. They wanted to have local people who would do this. That's why they did the contracting model. So Jesus eating with this group is eating with a bunch of collaborators. Some have wondered if, because they're handling money, are they therefore ritually impure? Maybe, but I think most of the complaint about them is this issue, is that they are with the hated Romans. And it also would make sense why they're paired with sinners. Who are sinners? Well, sinners are those ritually impure. And this is a tricky one because I think today if you hear someone described as sinners, a sinner, we mean something particular, a particular kind of offense. In this case, probably not. It is simply those people who do not try to remain ritually pure. Perhaps don't wash their hands before they eat. Perhaps don't go to synagogue. Perhaps those people who are not following the purity rules that were especially emphasized by the Pharisees, who were trying to say that everyone should follow the same purity rules that the priests follow, so that then you could go in and worship. And again, worship and eating are one thing. So if you have not gone through proper purity rules, but you do go ahead and eat and worship in your eating, then now this is an offense to God. And if I am eating with you, if we are doing that collectively, then my presence among you makes me ritually impure. I have not prepared myself for worship. Remember, they have an idea of a collective identity, not an individual identity. So therefore, we are all worshiping, and now I've become not prepared for worship. I've made myself complicit in this. And so therefore, what Jesus is eating with the tax collectors and the sinners, who he's eating with are Roman collaborators and those who are ritually impure. Now that's usually the groups we talk about, but this group often is forgotten. The people he eats most often with are the disciples. The disciples, as far as we know, except for a couple of cases, they don't practice purity rules. They grind meal on the Sabbath. They don't wash their hands before they eat. So there's some purity rules they're breaking, but we don't know that they were continually breaking these rules. They would have been sinners in a modern Protestant model of the sense of everyone is sinful before God. That's what Paul would say. But they weren't in these categories. One was a tax collector, but that was it. And when he's following Jesus, he's no longer a tax collector, seemingly. But what were they? More than anything, they were simply ordinary people. They've left their jobs, which is extraordinary, but this was a group of ordinary people who are following Jesus, but that doesn't necessarily make them more ritually pure than anybody else. It's just they were regular people who Jesus sat down and ate with. Then I mentioned this exception, these Pharisees. There are two Pharisees, interestingly, who both invite Jesus to come dine with them. Jesus, we're going to see in our next video about hospitality, doesn't turn down invitations. And in them, both of them lead to lessons. The dialogue isn't necessarily good, but the conversation and the eating isn't a problem. Jesus will come and recline at the table and eat with them. They reclined when they ate, didn't have chairs that sat up. That was very low to the ground. And so Jesus actually eats with a lot of people. Open Commensality has tax collectors, sinners, people you'd think Jesus would want to spend time with, those who you might be surprised, and the ones that nobody wanted to spend time with, and then the people who were the religious elites. Jesus does not abandon them either. So we have a very diverse group of people that Jesus is going and sitting and dining with. And so next time we're going to talk about hospitality and what this all would mean. But I think in order to understand it, we have to understand who these people are. And then we can start to see this is who Jesus comes and sits and eats with. And so are these the most horrible people on earth? No. Is these the most pure people on earth? Absolutely not. And are these people just the enemies you never meet? Well, also, no. It's diverse, and Jesus embraces that. This has just been an overview of who Jesus eats with in the Gospel of Luke. Look forward to our next video on this question of hospitality. This has been Theology Bits. I'm Pastor Ben.